Hi guys, and welcome to section 6 of our AWS Certified SysOps Administrator course. This is the deployment and provisioning section of the course. In this particular section, we're going to be taking a look at what are the best practices to deploy and provision your applications on the AWS platform. Specifically, we're going to give you an introduction to various deployment strategies. We'll take a look at the Amazon Elastic Load Balancers and how they can be used to deploy applications on the AWS platform in a highly available state. We'll also have a lab where we configure an application load balancer as part of our Elastic Load Balancer module. And then we'll move on to take a look at scalability in the cloud with Amazon Autoscaling. So let's get started. Okay, so in this video, we'll move on to introduce you to some deployment strategies available on AWS. So let's get started. Okay, so AWS offers you a number of different approaches to deploy and provision your applications in the cloud, and as well as ensuring that your applications are highly available, fault-tolerant, scalable, and cost-effective. As a SysOps administrator, it is your responsibility to obviously manage these deployments in an effective and efficient manner. Now, you can use various AWS services to build your core infrastructure and then develop the effective deployment strategies that you need to design and deploy your solutions. You can utilize VPCs, for example, to build a highly secure network for hosting your applications. You can utilize EC2 instances on which you can deploy your application. You can use several database services, RDS, DynamoDB, Redshift, in order to provision the database layer of your applications. And in between all of that, there are several AWS application layer services that can enable you to design highly effective, efficient workflow processes. In addition to that, you obviously have the ability to use several automation tools to ensure consistency in application deployment, ease of management, faster turnaround times, whilst avoiding the configuration drift. What do we mean by the configuration drift? Well, imagine that you're deploying your solutions manually and you need to repeatedly deploy the same solution several times. As humans, we have a tendency to make changes without actually realizing it in our deployments. So for example, you may deploy a particular solution today where the security group of your web servers may be termed something along the lines of web servers SG, and then next week, you may be deploying the same solution, but this time you name your security group for your web service as Web Service Security Group. So this minor drift in the configuration design can actually cause a lot of problems later on. And AWS automation tools can help you ensure that you avoid this configuration drift. Now, there are some common approaches when you're looking at deploying applications in the cloud, and you need to consider design options that will help you deliver loosely coupled architectures for your deployment. You don't want too many dependencies in the actual deployment process, or even indeed between application components. You want to ensure that these are all loosely coupled so that you don't have a single point of failure. Let's take a look at an example of deploying applications on an EC2 instance, for example. So one of the strategies that are used to deploy applications on EC2 instances is known as bootstrapping. Essentially, what you do is you run a script at the time of launching your instance for the first time. And that script may do something like pull down an application setup files and then install the application on the server so that when the server is up and running, it already has the application installed on it. You would usually use this, for example, when you're setting up web servers and you need to install things like PHP and Apache web servers and things like that. Now, obviously, what bootstrapping does is it provisions your server to a certain level so that you can start using it almost immediately, and the time factor is substantially reduced rather than manually logging onto the server and then running all those setup files. There are some issues with bootstrapping, however, in that if you have complex applications, the whole process can be entirely slow, okay, because it pulls down the files, it needs to install them, they need to be configured in a particular way. An even better strategy would be to consider building what we call golden images, and then, if required, use additional bootstrapping scripts to run some additional scripts later on. Now, golden images are basically AMI's Amazon machine images that you have created that have the basic necessary elements for your application deployment. They may even have the application pre-installed, they may be designed and configured in a particular way, the server might be hardened for various security requirements, etc., etc. Another terminology used is baking an image. So instead of just using the bootstrap script to deploy your application, which could extend the time taken to deploy your servers and your application, by using golden images or images that are pre-baked, you are able to get faster turnaround times to market. Next, we have to have in place some form of configuration management. How exactly you configure your applications, how exactly you configure your deployments needs to be documented effectively, including things with how you do upgrades and updates, etc. System operators need to keep track of configurations that are taking place on their applications and on their deployments, and then be able to make changes as necessary following a proper change management process in conjunction with their configuration management. In addition to that, we also use tagging. Now, tagging is a very useful tool that's available on the AWS platform. Throughout the labs, you've always been encouraged to ensure that you tag your resources that you're deploying accurately. Tagging allows you to also manage cost allocation processes much more efficiently. If you work for an organization that has implemented chargebacks, for instance, from the various departments, tagging can actually help you identify which department, which business unit is using what resource and the amount of money they're spending on your AWS account. We also have the ability to configure IAM roles and use instance profiles. Now, IAM roles is a much more secure method of assigning permissions to your resources and your applications so that they can interface and interact with other AWS services rather than use long-term credentials like access key IDs and secret access key combinations. Now, the way how this works is when you launch an EC2 instance, you specify an IAM role to associate with the instance. Applications that then run on the instance can then use the role supplied to get the temporary credentials to make those API calls. Instance profile are a great way of embedding the necessary IAM roles that are required to carry out the operation to access those AWS resources. An instance profile is essentially just a container of an IAM role that you can use to pass the role information to an EC2 instance when the instance starts. Next, I want to take a look at deploying load balancing strategies. Now, we're going to cover this in a lot more detail in an upcoming video when we talk about elastic load balancers. But the whole idea is that you are always going to have a fleet of EC2 instances that is serving the same type of content or application. You need to be able to load balance your traffic to all of these instances that are supporting your application. And there are several strategies that you can employ in order to deploy your load balancing service. And we'll talk more about that in an upcoming video. You also need to think about scalability. How exactly are you going to scale out when demand increases? And then what do you do when demand drops? How do you scale back in? And obviously, you can use tools like auto-scaling to help you achieve this. And again, there's an upcoming video on scalability, and then we'll deep dive into that in a lot more detail. And then finally, there's monitoring. Now, monitoring is an important part of a SysOps administrator's day-to-day operations. You need to be able to monitor your environment, see exactly what's happening with your EC2 instances, ideally set up and deploy detailed monitoring for all of your EC2 instances, and then be able to report on exactly what's happening with your EC2 instances, generate alarms so that you can get alerted, and then take appropriate actions when certain triggers have been met. Now, in terms of actually deploying your applications, and specifically when you're performing various upgrades and updates, there's a process known as continuous deployment strategies that you can employ. And there are 3 different approaches or methods that you can look at. We have what's called the in-place upgrade. This is where you perform application updates on existing fleet of EC2 instances. It gives you rapid deployment and consistent rollout schedules, and your deployment tools include Code Deploy, Elastic Beanstalk, and OpsWorks that you can use to perform your in-place upgrades. We also have the option to go for a replacement upgrade, and this is where you launch new EC2 instances and redirect traffic to the new fleet of instances, terminating the old ones once you're happy that the upgrade is successful. It's simpler to design, you avoid the complexity of upgrading existing instances, and you're essentially designing what we call immutable infrastructure. The third option is what we call Bluegreen deployments. Fancy term that is. But essentially what you have is you have 2 identical stacks running in their own environments. You migrate traffic from the current stack, what we call the blue deployment, to the new version, which is the green deployment. The latest application revision is installed on replacement instances and traffic rerouted to these instances. And you can offer 0 downtime, and applications can be tested on the new instances ahead of time. AWS tools like CloudFormation, Elastic Beanstalk, and OpsWorks offer blue-green deployment functionality. So we have a diagram here of a typical blue-green deployment and the strategies to cut over. We have our existing application, which is the blue deployment, and the new version of the application, which is the green deployment, in a separate container altogether. Our clients normally were connecting to the blue deployment. And what we've done over here is each of these deployments have got load balancers in front of them. So you can imagine these being web application servers there's a fleet of them, and obviously you need to distribute traffic to them. So we've got application load balancers in front of them doing that portion of the work. And now in terms of the actual cutover process, there are various tools that you can actually utilize to ensure that your cutover is as smooth as possible. One of them is Route 53, which gives you the ability to utilize various routing policies in order to distribute your traffic to your various services. In this case, we could use the weighted round robin policy, which allows you to send traffic based on different weights to different deployments. So our weighted routed policy is setting at a weight of 90 over here, which means that the maximum traffic is going to the existing blue deployment. And once we've deployed our green deployment, which is a new version upgrade, we start sending some of the traffic to the green deployment. We can slowly but surely decrease the weight for the blue deployment over a period of time and increase the weight of the green deployment. And this will ensure that we have a smoother transition between the type of traffic that is flowing from the blue deployment to the green deployment. This can also be used as a way of testing the new green deployment. You could, for instance, if this is a website, you could have a little survey that takes place on the green deployment that says, hey guys, listen, we've just upgraded our web application. Tell us what you think. Is there any issue with it, etc., etc. And then based on that survey, you can decide whether to continue modifications to your green deployment or whether you're ready to go live. Once you are ready to go live, you can obviously transition and reduce the weightage on the blue deployment, increasing the weightage at the same time on the green deployment. And then over a period of time, and this could be days, weeks, however you want to do this, migrate completely from the blue deployment to the green deployment. Right, so that brings us to the end of our introduction to deployment strategies on the AWS platform.